on Politics Live.
Liz Truss launches popular conservatism. Is Britain suffering a sick note culture? And are young men turning against feminism? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Kit Malthouse, Labour MP Jess Phillips, the Independent Zoe Grunewald and Henry Hill of Conservative Home. On today's programme.
Obviously, like everyone else, you're shocked and sad, and just all our thoughts are with him and his family.
The Prime Minister says the King's cancer was caught early as His Majesty begins treatment and steps back from public duties.
Because it's difficult being a Conservative at the moment. It's why we need a popular Conservative movement to actually challenge from below what is happening in our country.
Liz Truss launches popular conservatism. Is it a threat to Rishi Sunak? Record numbers say they are too sick to work. Are NHS waiting lists to blame?
NHS waiting lists.
We have not made enough progress.
You failed on that pledge.
Yes.
For the last 4 or 5 years, we've started to see this gap emerge where young men seem to think feminism's potentially done more harm than good.
Why are some Generation Z boys and men turning against feminism? As you heard there, King Charles has started treatment for cancer after being diagnosed while receiving treatment for an enlarged prostate. You heard the Prime Minister in the headlines saying that while it was a shock, it was also a relief that the cancer had been caught early. Now, in the past, monarchs have chosen not to share personal details of illnesses or conditions they may have. King Charles, who's 75, has broken that tradition. Is that level of transparency from the monarch to be welcomed, Kit?
I think so, yes. I mean, certainly when the initial news came in that he was going to hospital for an enlarged prostate, I think there was a huge bump in men going. And I think it's particularly appetite for men, to be honest with you, because quite a lot of us don't bother or leave it until it's too late. I have to tell you, last year I got one of those test kits from the NHS for bowel cancer. I reached a certain age where you get it automatically. And, of course, I ignored it for a few weeks. Until it mysteriously appeared in the bathroom. I don't know quite
so you did actually?
Did it. Yeah. Ended up having to go and be scanned, all the rest of it, but was all clear. So I think it is very good to encourage people to think about scanning, because the two things we know about cancer. One, early diagnosis is catch it early, you've got a much better chance of beating the thing. And two, the science is getting better and better day by day. I've got a friend who's broadly over the last 6 months been essentially cured of esophageal cancer late stage, which was found by accident. And that's down to amazing science that's coming out of this country.
Do you think that level of transparency from the monarch is to be welcomed? I mean, there will be a lot of people who are shocked by the news, and there could be worry and concern generally. But on balance?
I think, I think it would be hard to hide, and actually I think it's a good thing it's to be promoted. What I worry about is that them having some sort of halfway house of saying I have cancer, and then the level of speculation that comes. And I want him to be afforded privacy. Like my family, my mother died of cancer, my sister-in-law is currently dying of cancer, and the idea of doing that with the full glare, but it's yet to be seen, I think, how we all react to this. And I think that just saying cancer is more than any other monarch's done before, but is leading to what I can only describe as absolutely cracker speculation on the television. Like, he's already dead in some regards. He's definitely not going to die in other regards. And then what if it's this one? What if it's that one? Maybe we should all just leave them be.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think I agree with both of you. On the one hand, I think it's really important, especially with things like prostate cancer or any of those cancers that affect men and disproportionately men don't go and get them checked out in time. I think it's really good, actually, that the King has been so open about that. But I also agree that when you give a certain level of information,
some of the details,
people fill in the gaps. And as you say, he should be afforded his privacy as well. So it's a difficult balance for Buckingham Palace to get right.
Right, and because we won't see him publicly for some time, we don't know exactly how long. Have they got the balance right, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's early days, but yeah, I think so far, because there is, yeah, as everyone else has said, there is a balance to be struck between the King setting an example to the nation and giving a level of transparency that we expect in the 21st century. You know, if he simply retreated to Balmoral for a couple of years, that wouldn't have worked. But on the other hand, you know, this could turn into prurience, right? There's a level at which the press speculation simply turns into one man's suffering being turned into entertainment, and that should absolutely not happen. And I think there will be pressure because all of these institutions, when you've got a 24-hour media and when you've got a media that's generating these stories day after day, there is a temptation to try and control it by giving them stuff. Just draw a line. We know he's ill, we wish him well, and then that's it.
We're going to talk about the Conservative Party. You will have heard on previous Politics Live programmes talk of the 5 families of the Conservative Party. Well, Liz Truss, former Prime Minister, has been launching a new Conservative pressure group this morning. Let's hear a little bit more of what she had to say.
It's not enough to just have the policies when the system is actively working to stop those policies happen. Conservatives really need to be thinking about how we change the system itself and how we create the political weather that enable these policies to happen. Because it's difficult being a Conservative at the moment. It's difficult advocating these causes, and it's why we need a popular Conservative movement to actually challenge from below what is happening in our country.
What is Liz Truss up to?
Good question.
I mean, you were a fan.
Yeah,
you were a fan. You supported her. You were in her cabinet.
No, I haven't supported any candidate in the leadership elections.
But you did serve in her cabinet.
I did, and I was surprised when she offered me the job. I hadn't been a supporter. I was at the cabinet office during the summer, just doing my job, getting the country through a difficult summer and getting ready for a new leader. But nevertheless, she did kindly offer me a job. But to be honest with you, I've never been one for joining these different factions and groups. As far as I was concerned, I was only really ever a member of one gang, and that's the Conservative Party. I was briefly a member of the ERG, but learnt the error of my ways early on. And so I have to confess to you, I tend to cleave to that Ronald Reagan maxim of never speaking ill of a fellow Conservative, but I think in election year it's not that helpful.
Right. I mean, she's talking about a sort of grassroots challenge from below. They say they're not a threat to Rishi Sunak. So what's the point? I mean, what do you read into what she's saying?
It's worth remembering that the Conservative Party, like all political parties, is a kind of standing coalition of different interests, right? And we're most powerful when we pool those interests in a sort of central cause. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is some of those coalition parts are trying to identify themselves separately. And what I hope is that as we move towards a general election, people will realise the power. And you'll remember when Ken Clarke and John Redwood were on the same leadership ticket.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes.
Right. Well, that's when the Conservative Party's really powerful, when those different factions come together in one mission. And I hope that's what's going to happen over the next 6 months.
Well, how do you rate the chances of that happening? Henry, I'll just show the HuffPost headline. Exclusive, Liz Truss remains really unpopular ahead of popular conservatism launch. Irony obviously reigning here, poll reveals.
I mean, on a personal level, you've got to have some sympathy for somebody making a spirited effort to file a second draft of their political obituary. But I think this faction's problem is the fact that Liz Truss is leading it. Because even if you like her, even if you like her politics, even if you like her policy prescriptions, she failed. And she's like a byword for political disaster in the country. If you can't find more people, the thing she didn't mention there, that was good stuff on structures. You really do need to think structurally about how the economy works before you try and mess with it. It's the kind of talk you should have had before you tried to mess with it. But personnel is the other big thing that we're not hearing there, because you need people with the skill and the ideas and the ability to connect with the public. And this is not that, right? Like on day one, if you're having to explain that people are getting your name wrong, and it's not about you're saying you're popular, it's because you want to be popular, like that's not a great position for any group to be starting in. It's not a danger to Rishi Sunak, because Rishi Sunak has a job that nobody wants, which is Prime Minister when you're 20 points down in the polls 8 months out from a general election. But it is a symptom of the fact that he is not providing intellectual leadership for the party, and is going to have to fight a very defensive election, which is going to mean abandoning a lot of MPs.
Right. I mean, do you want to defend... I mean, you did serve under her while she was Prime Minister. Is there anything that you would say in her defence?
Well, I mean, I'm not here to defend popular Conservatives. That's for them to do.
But Liz Truss.
My view is some of the things that Liz espoused during her brief period as Prime Minister, I did support. I do think we need big structural reform in the economy. I do think there was lots that could be done on the supply side to deliver it. And everybody now, including the Labour Party, are talking about growth. And that was the central economic proposal that she brought forward,
Jess,
that we needed growth.
Well, let Jess respond. Let Jess respond.
The idea that Liz Truss invented talking about economic growth is absolutely for the birds. I mean, she's most famous for talking about cheese. I mean, Liz Truss one thing that she clearly hasn't done is improve her ability to make a speech. That was pretty dreadful, and I actually didn't understand what Henry just explained about what he viewed as what she was trying to say I didn't get at all. So I think they've got some communications issues. What I think that Rishi Sunak's problem in this is that he didn't even bother to turn up and the vote against Boris Johnson in the Privileges Committee. He repeatedly shows that he cannot get rid of these, that he cannot get hold or act with any discipline about these basically factions within his political party, and he needs to show a bit of strength. I mean, I'd kick Liz Truss out of the party if I was him.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What's wrong with a bit of lively intellectual debate?
You're not getting it from Liz Truss.
I just put that forward as a notion. You were there. Zoe, what was it like?
Well, I wasn't
launch?
actually inside, but I was outside watching the people turning up, and I have to say there wasn't that many people. There were a few MPs that came by, some people went in, but actually the most noise was being made by Steve Bray and his megaphone, rather than a overwhelming bit of support for Liz Truss and her policies. Listen, the thing I think is troubling about this is it just shows how incredibly out of touch part of the Conservative Party is. This is the sort of thing when you're in opposition, when you've had a terrible loss and you have to really gaze inwards and say, what are we doing wrong? When you're the governing party, there are issues that you need to address. There are so many issues that we need to address. There's a cost of living crisis, NHS waiting list, which we'll get onto. And rather than pooling their expertise and their knowledge and their years of experience together and say, what policy solutions do we come up with? They're getting incredibly ideological, they're navel-gazing, and the public look on and think, what is this? This is supposed to be the party that governs. And I think that's what people will see when they look at yet another factional launch today. They'll say, we don't need another faction, we need governance.
Well, let's see what you all make of Rishi Sunak, who's got into some hot water for appearing to accept a £1,000 bet with the presenter Piers Morgan over the government's Rwanda policy. Let's take a look.
If I said to you, I'll bet you £1,000 to a refugee charity you don't get anybody on those planes before the election, will you take that bet?
Well, I want to get the people on the planes, right? Of course I want to get the people on the planes.
£1,000.
Right, I want to get the people on the planes.
Wise, shaking hands with Piers Morgan on a bet about the Rwanda policy.
OK, so I think it's probably unwise to accept a bet, but I'm not sure that's necessarily what he did. He didn't say, yes, OK, you're on. He shook a hand that was proffered. I mean, I haven't spoken to Downing Street about what their interpretation of that particular meeting was.
Well, don't worry, because we have Rishi Sunak explaining the reason or his excuse, however you want to look at it, because he was interviewed on BBC Radio 5 Live this morning with Rachel Burden.
Well, if I'm being totally honest, I'm not a betting person, and I was taken totally by surprise in the middle of that interview. And the point I was trying to get across...
Was it a mistake to shake his hand?
No, well, the point I was trying to get across, I said I was taken totally by surprise. The point I was trying to get across was actually about the Rwanda policy and about tackling illegal migration, because it's something I care deeply about.
I mean...
So it sounds to me, as I say, I mean, you know what it's like. I mean, anybody who's done an interview like that, if you're taken by surprise, somebody sticks their hand out, I'm not sure he agreed to a bet on that, and I'd be very surprised, knowing him as I do, that if he would have done, because, as I said, he's not a gambling person. But, you know, you do get taken by surprise.
He was a hedge fund manager. He literally took part in a gamble that actually was part of the process for the financial crisis. I'm not a gambling man. I mean, what kind of hedge fund manager is he then if he's not a gambling man?
You can try and do this smeary demonising thing if you want, but the truth is, in this situation... No, you do.
Is it a smear to say that he was a hedge fund banker?
No, but you paint it as a negative.
What's a negative? Well, hold that thought just for a moment, because Jess is right. He said he's not a betting man, but here he is talking on Test Match Special last year.
But I also, which was quite dangerous, discovered this. I think it was around that time that the spread betting had become a thing online.
Yep.
I had certainly never done it before. But then, so I was sitting there working on one side doing my, investing finance job, and on the other screen, it's quite helpful in those jobs, you have multiple screens. On the other screen, I was doing, next wicket partnership, next wicket for innings total. I just discovered this thing, and it was great. So I had the summer doing that as well.
Yeah. Sounds rather exciting, spread betting.
Yeah, not something I've ever done. I wouldn't know.
But what do you make of Rishi Sunak saying he's not a betting man?
I mean, so I have to confess to you, I'm not a betting man, but I have occasionally put some money on the Grand National. Right, my great-grandmother used to always say, bet on a grey, and that's what I've generally done over the years. But would I call myself... I'm not in and out of Ladbrokes every Saturday, no. And I think it's probably the same with him. I mean, I don't understand what the point is we're trying to make.
He made a mistake.
But what?
He should have said to Piers Morgan, it's a bit crass, actually. I'm not going to do it, but I'm telling you that I'm going to try and get some planes off the ground. Look, if the man cannot cope with dealing with Piers Morgan, good luck going toe-to-toe with Putin.
Well, can we talk about something more important then?
Yeah, we will. Henry.
He wasn't enthusiastic about that. The vibe was kind of someone who's just signed up to give £25 a month to a donkey sanctuary from someone on his local high street. And I don't think that that's a bet that's going to happen. But I think the more interesting thing about that interview, if you want to talk about something more important, is that Rishi kept pivoting back onto Rwanda. And the moment Piers tried to ask him about legal immigration, which is, sky high, he immediately pivoted back onto Rwanda. And people keep asking, why do the Tories keep talking about this policy that is not doing them any favours? And it's because they think that immigration is one of the few issues where they've got a wedge with Labour. And they can't talk about legal immigration because they're running the most laissez-faire immigration policies this country has ever had. So that's why they're stuck talking about Rwanda. I think that's the real serious takeaway to take out of that interview.
Well, but let's have a look at the Labour Party on a different subject. And this headline, Jess, in The Guardian. British Muslims losing trust in Labour over its handling of Israel-Gaza war. Party figure says it has work to do to retain support as poll shows drop in Starmer's popularity. You resigned your front bench position over Labour's stance on the Israel-Gaza war and not calling for an immediate ceasefire. What do you make of this story?
I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but I would say that anyone who relies on any grouping, look at Scotland, if you will, for the Labour Party over the years, anyone who takes advantage and relies on the constant and loyal support of any particular grouping, it will always come back to bite you in the bum. And so, look, I think the Labour Party has to work really, really hard to make sure that that community, and every community, in fact, at the moment, that's the gig in an election year, feels confident and comfortable with it. And I would be lying if I said that people in my constituency weren't concerned about the Israel-Gaza war as probably their most pressing political issue.
But working with communities, does that mean, would you like to see Labour change its policy stance?
Well, Labour has changed its policy stance. Labour's policy is for a ceasefire, an enduring ceasefire. So,
well, an enduring ceasefire, not an immediate, which is what the SNP motion that you resigned to back at the time actually says.
I mean, I think that we're sort of splitting hairs on the sort of language the Labour Party have repeatedly said now, and also been, I would say, much firmer than the government have about the ICJ ruling, the International Criminal Court, around what has been found, and trying to push Israel to show some resistance in what they're doing.
The Labour Muslim Network, which commissioned the poll, says this is a crisis point for the party and its relationship with British Muslims, and the leadership must change paths now or risk losing the support of the Muslim community for a generation. What do you make of it?
I mean, I think there are concerns, and Jess touched on them within the party about this. There are a number of constituencies that have quite a large population of Muslim voters there, and they will be concerned about this. You shouldn't generalise what one group thinks either. And I think a lot of people in the country do understand the nuances of this really difficult international political situation. I think, unfortunately for Starmer, he did misspeak a bit during that LBC interview, and I think people will remember that.
Water and,
Exactly, and I think there will be some way to go to bring back trust there. But I think if Labour carries on the path it is very certain and very solid that Israel must do things within the bounds of international law, as you would expect any country to do, then they should be able to bring back the support. But it is a matter of being, contrite and realising that they have made a mistake. And
if I knock doors in my more majoritively Muslim areas, and to be fair, that's, they're fairly well spread across my constituency and the city I live in. you know, people still will talk to me about, you know, bad housing regulation more than they talk to me about this, is the reality. But, you know, we shouldn't pretend that the issues that matter to our voters shouldn't be, you know, top of our priority list.
And it's good for a party as well to adapt to what its voter base is telling it. Any party that sticks with the line
I mean, in anything.
I think you're to be fair to Jess, I think she's doing her best to put a gloss on the Labour Party position, because as far as I can see, they're in the same position.
I resigned.
They're in the same. Well, listen, I got a letter together calling for an immediate ceasefire from 10 of my colleagues as well. So my view is that both the Labour leadership and the Conservative leadership are in the wrong place on this, and there needs to be an immediate ceasefire. I don't know what sustainable ceasefire means. Once you start to qualify the word ceasefire, it becomes meaningless.
So have you relayed that you
we wrote
called
to the Prime Minister before Christmas.
Forgive me for missing it.
He did.
He did?
Sorry, we wrote to David Cameron, but we got a letter back saying the same sustainable ceasefire thing.
I think the other one thing to note is that when you're looking at things like this, when we talk about engaging with communities, I think it makes me slightly wary, because there is this unfortunate tendency in politics sometimes, and both parties do it, but you engage with community leaders, and especially in town halls, you end up with this kind of like American-style machine politics and the block vote. And I think that's a danger, because it's one thing to make an offer as a national party to individual citizens, be they Muslim or anything else. But once you start trying to do that kind of game playing, that's when you can end up with machines that can defect.
I totally agree.
I understand that. I do agree, although I have to say I think there's a different thing going on here, because there can be an accumulation of views in a particular community that makes them believe that they are somehow not on the same level as everybody else. And for better or worse, there are a lot of people in the Muslim community who think that their lives matter less, or the lives of Muslims matter less than other people's lives. And we see that also in things like the citizenship laws, where we have a law that allows us to remove certain British citizens' citizenship if they don't behave well, but not others.
But that's based on dual nationality.
Yeah, but that makes people feel like second-class citizens. It's not based on dual nationality.
I'm a dual.
It's based on the possible right to another citizenship, not actually having it.
All right, well, before we move on, just a reminder to join me tomorrow here at 11:15. Are you listening? At 11:15 on BBC Two and BBC iPlayer, when Rishi Sunak will have his weekly appointment with Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions. And amongst my guests will be the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Laura Trott, and the Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson. That's all on tomorrow from 11:15, and obviously after Prime Minister's Questions. Let's talk about this headline in the Daily Mail. Sick note Britain. Long-term illness hits a record high at 2.8 million, more than double the number of unemployed adults. Kit, why is there such a big rise in the number of people classified as not looking for work because of health reasons?
Good question. I mean, some of it is...
Well, I was hoping you might be able to...
I mean, good question. Some of it is COVID hangover, obviously.
In the sense of people just getting used to long COVID, or people getting used, or
I think a series of mental health issues coming out of the pandemic. I think some people also kind of found that existing conditions they can manage with became exacerbated. It's hard to tell, really, and I do think that the government needs to do some serious work to work out why. I don't think there's one simple solution as to why so many people are taking themselves out of the workforce. I mean, there is a school of thought that says, well, maybe we need to use universal credit and that structure that incentivises work and supports people back into work much more assertively. But at the same time, we have got a big problem, and nobody really at the moment is giving me any answer as to why.
Right, has the government done enough to tackle this problem?
Well, they're certainly trying. I mean, Mel Stride seems to be having reforms underway which are designed to help and support people back into work, but we could, always turbocharge it. And frankly, to be honest with you, in constituencies like mine, where I've got businesses crying out for people, we have an economic interest in getting people back to work.
But Jess, I mean, if Labour wins the election, this will be a problem for a Labour government. What would they do about it, or what do you think they should do about it?
I mean, the first thing that that Kit didn't mention is that we have got people on very long waiting lists, waiting for treatment, both and mental health. I mean, I was about to swear, I won't swear, but you cannot get mental health treatment. I mean, when people come in to see me, I am like, I can put you on a list if you like. So there is huge amounts of people whose sicknesses, and I'm afraid to say poverty, exacerbates people's sickness. Michael Marmot was on the television yesterday saying that it was poverty and ill health were causing basically long-term chronic illnesses, and that is keeping people out of work. Now, then, when you get people into work, you have to make sure that they're paid well enough to survive.
Well, but those are the problems. So what would Labour do? Would you pay people more? Would you have a massive expansion of mental health service?
Well, yes, we would have an expansion in mental health services, and also, initially you need to get more appointments into the NHS because there just aren't enough. There isn't enough capacity to deal with the current waiting.
But not with more money, of course.
Yeah, well, there is money. The Labour Party have allocated, I think it's 1.6 billion for specifically 2 million extra appointments.
Do you think that will transform those figures?
Well, I think in the short term it will, but absolutely in the long term it has to be a much more long-termist reform.
You're nodding in agreement?
Does the NHS need reform? Absolutely it does. I think coming out of the pandemic, we all accepted that the machine, that great ship, is kind of creaking and needs modernising. Look, we've got more doctors and more nurses than we've ever had in the history of the NHS, and yet the waiting lists remain where they are. Some of that is about strikes. Some of that is about COVID hangover.
Could you have done
something? Some of that
something?
is also about the fact, frankly, no, hold on, is that we've got a system that was designed post-war, that's dealing with a demographic that has changed. It was designed to deal with people who were essentially going to die in their 70s, and now people are living to their 90s. They're retiring at 55, whereas they're retiring at 65, 67 before. We've got a demographic problem that
and those are all the explanations we hear endlessly. But the Tories have been in government a long time, and these waiting lists do predate the pandemic. Of course, it's got a lot worse since the pandemic. But Rishi Sunak, this is a BBC News headline, admits, well, we heard it in the headlines, he's failed to cut NHS waiting lists. Is admitting it good enough? Just saying, yes, we failed.
Well, he's saying, look, as I look at the pattern of waiting lists, there are two things that come through. First of all, before the strike started, waiting lists were falling pretty quickly. Secondly, the pattern is not consistent across the country. I was talking to Chris Clarkson this morning, who was on your show just a couple of weeks ago. He was saying his trusts in North Manchester are rattling through people. My trust is doing pretty well too. So it's it's localised. But secondly, when you've got large parts of the workforce on strike, it shouldn't come as a surprise that things get delayed.
Yeah, but yes, they are on strike, and they have been on strike. It's absolutely true. We can talk about consultants and junior doctors. But again, is that a failure of poor industrial relations, Henry, over a long period of time?
I mean, yeah, to an extent. Basically, you've got all sorts of problems with the NHS. You've got the looming battle over physician associates, which was the NHS's attempt to do basic doctoring on the cheap. And that's going to cause a massive internal row. The Conservatives have a point in that if you accept a large pay offer for the medical unions, that isn't a one-off payment. That is permanently locking in higher salary costs for the NHS, basically in perpetuity. So that is a big problem. The problem that they have when they keep, to go back to this sort of, when they talk about breaking the strikes, the way Thatcher did, is that with the big strikes of the 80s were big transformative strikes that changed the industries they were in to the point where the unions were no longer relevant, the print workers, the miners, whatever, which is not the case with the NHS. If you broke this strike somehow, they'd be back next year. So I think if the Conservatives have failed, it's not that they didn't keep spending as much as New Labour did, because New Labour was explicitly about a plan to transform NHS spending. They've done two things. One, they failed to challenge, I think, one of the basic things about the NHS, which is that currently we spend everything from the taxpayers' time, whereas in other countries, private money can co-support public spending, which allows them to spend a higher percentage of GDP. And two, they haven't changed the structure of the NHS. If you wanted to change industrial relations in the NHS, you could have broken it up a bit. So you had more like, if an NHS trust employed its own staff, you could have union negotiations with managers over pay, but no national pay bargaining.
But as you say, it hasn't happened. I mean, is Labour going to be able to do anything? Are they going to really be able to cut waiting lists? Yes, a little bit of money has been pledged. Yes, but that was a very long time ago. The economy was a lot more benign than it is now, and taxes did go up to pay for it.
Well, I think Labour are making some of the right noises, but actually I have to say one of the things that neither party is really talking about, and this is very important to helping improve the NHS, is social care. And you absolutely, waiting lists are, one of the reasons they're so high is because of bed blocking, because people can't get back out into the community. Social care and NHS care are not properly integrated. There isn't enough money. And neither party want to touch this with a barge pole because it's caused so much political headache for them in the past. What we really need is a transformative social care system that takes into account exactly what Kit was saying, that we have an ageing population with much more complex needs, comorbidities, and that you cannot create a functioning NHS without a functioning social care system with the same sort of funding and the same sort of priorities.
Is this going to be the sort of election cornerstone issue, NHS waiting lists?
Yeah, it always is, right? Like NHS, police, taxes. It's pretty much what every single election is won on from the beginning of time until now, and it's not any different. And on social care, the problem is that we've given it to, we've basically swapped it under the rug with councils, right? We've made social care a statutory responsibility of councils to keep it off the government's books, and now councils are all catching fire and falling over because they're having to spend all of their money on statutory responsibility. So yeah, we do need a proper social care system, but bringing that onto central government books would be cripplingly expensive, and no party wants to do it.
Right, and we know how difficult it is because Theresa May tried to introduce a social care policy in an election, and that didn't go very well. So, I mean, what can you do going into election? Rishi Sunak saying, yes, we failed to cut waiting lists, and the Labour Party is saying we've got no more money, reform. I mean, is that going to set the world
in my view, that we need to think differently about how we provide social care. At the moment, what we're doing is sticking with a particular system and a particular way of doing it and just thinking we have to pump more and more money in. The only question is who's going to pay. Is it me? Is it the state? Is it everybody? That's the problem. And I think there are other models of social care which make more sense. So, for example, I'm a big fan of an organisation called Shared Lives. What Shared Lives do is they say, right, if you're, say, an elderly person living in a home where you've got room, we'll find a younger person who's got a housing need, who will give them a bit of money and a bit of training. They can live with you. You form a bond, effectively, and provide social care. And when you meet these, because it does happen a bit here and there in the country, when you meet them, it's incredible, the quality of the relationship, the care that's given, the longevity in the home, the stimulation that the individual gets. Now, we only have a few thousand of these placements across the country. If we move that upwards, effectively us doing what other countries that don't have this problem do, which is have multi-generational households, you would have a solution to your problem.
Or you spend more. And you spend a lot more, like other countries do.
But I just don't think we've got that kind of money.
Well, about priorities. I mean, a Labour government could spend more and could spend more of the GDP on public services.
What I would say is that this becomes a terrible political football in the lead up to an election, and everybody is guilty of that. I'm not going to pretend that the Labour Party isn't also guilty of that. But what I very much hope is that after the next election, something is going to be done about this. This is absolutely... It would be genuinely popular as well.
All right, hang on. One thing I would say about the countries that spend a higher percentage of GDP on healthcare is that a lot of that is because they have a system that allows private spend to come in and top up social provision.
See, this is where I think Henry is right.
Spending it through taxation is something no other country does.
Can I just show you this and you can comment and say what you wanted to say anyway, because dental treatment, as you know, is another critical issue. I think there's a headline which says Bristol, hundreds of... Right, well, actually, we can see it. Hundreds are queuing. Look at that line. This is in queuing in hope of NHS dental treatment in Bristol, trying to register. I mean, it is incredible visually just to look at it. I mean, what do you make of that, Jess?
I mean, I tried to get a dentist appointment and I had to ring 19 places and I still didn't manage to get an NHS dentist. That is, I have to say, and what I make of it is I'm not surprised. I did a little jig recently because my passport arrived within a week and I couldn't believe that a system actually worked. So I felt like I'd won the lottery. Like, nothing works. I mean, this is... Well, great. The most basic administrative system I can get a passport, which was made... incidentally, in a different country. It's just absolutely appalling that this is... And people in my constituency are pulling their teeth out in their living rooms.
How's it come to this? You're nodding along. You are a Conservative.
Yeah, no, I understand. The same is true in my constituency. We've had problems with dental and I've been campaigning in meetings with ministers. I understand there's a dental recovery plan which needs to be published as quickly as possible, please, because it is a major problem. But fundamentally, this problem comes down to a change in contract back in, I think, 2015 or 2016. Right. Which has disincentivised dentists from doing volume work.
Well, anyway, we'll leave it there, but people are literally pulling
the final thing I just want to say was, I think Henry is right, is that I hope that in this election there is an appetite in the country for us to have a sensible conversation about issues that have otherwise been the third rail. So there have been conversations about structural reform in the NHS, and every time anybody goes anywhere near it, they become too bad to burn and they're crucified for it.
That may be true. I think you'll be left
wanting.
I think you may be left wanting.
Not there.
Let me just show you this headline in The Guardian. Gen Z boys and men more likely than baby boomers to believe feminism harmful, says poll. This is research from the Policy Institute at King's College London, looking at the views of young men aged 16 to 29 about feminism and gender. Now, the Policy Institute tweeted about their polling. Let's take a look at a couple of the lines they picked out. Young men are notably less positive than young women about the impact of of feminism. Among those aged 16 to 29, 46% of women think feminism has done more good to society than harm. 10 percentage points higher than the share of young men who feel this way. And they pick this out. 3 in 10 young men think it'll be harder to be a man than a woman in 20 years' time. Young women, by contrast, are most pessimistic about the prospect of future progress on gender equality. Let's talk to Daniel Guinness. He's from an organisation called Beyond Equality. It works with boys and men to develop their understanding of masculinity and gender. Daniel, welcome to the programme. Were you surprised by these findings?
I wasn't surprised. I mean, working in this space day in, day out, we're seeing both those positive attitudes, but also those moments of hesitation and pushback coming up in our workshops and in the discussions from men and boys. So particularly those ideas, that uneasiness with a segment, with a minority, but with a large minority of boys about feminism. That's something that does come through in workshops.
Right. And why do you think that minority, a sizable minority, as you say, have those views? 16% of young men think feminism has done more harm than good to society.
Yeah, I mean, partly it's because they don't understand the term. And I would say for our priority as an organisation is not going to be to teach them, what does feminism mean, what doesn't it mean, but rather get at the issues and give them a chance to surface some of the things that they're worried about, that actually impacting upon them. And I think that's a better thing for us to be talking about. Like, what are the issues that those boys are experiencing or that they see around them? And the sorts of things that come up will be, there may be a sense that they're treated less well in the classroom in terms of more boys are going to be excluded from class. They might be, a lot of boys of that age are really deeply insecure about relationships and about sex. And yet feel a lot of expectation on them to be forming connections. And over the past 3 years, there's been some really powerful, wonderful shifts in society where we've been paying attention to the violence that women and girls experience. And in schools, that has meant the conversation has been about, how can we work with those boys to do really important prevention work? And sometimes that message hasn't quite come through in the way that it should have. And the boys haven't really been given a chance to process how can they fit themselves into that new vision of relationships.
All right.
So, yeah.
Well, Jess, Daniel, stay with us. But Jess, responding to what you've just heard.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me either at all. I think that also the idea of the baby boomer generation versus the younger generation, that's like apples and oranges. You're talking about people who lived through literally a technological revolution where progress was, and a generation that are living with that particular progress and how it actually steams into their lives with regard to pornography and the proliferation of that everywhere, and the kind of expectations that get put on young people by peer groups aren't just you and your mates now anymore. They're like thousands of people on your Roblox or whatever it is you're playing on online. Like that is frightening. But look, what I think that the antidote is people like Daniel who are specialists in talking about this, not expecting, because we passed legislation in 2016 around healthy relationship education. And actually the problem with that is that the standards of what that actually looks like in most people's schools is clumsy and makes it seem like we're saying all boys are rapists. And that's terrible. That's never, ever what the intention was. And that's why it needs to be done by really good specialists like Daniel himself.
Are you worried about some of these statistics, the polls?
I mean, it was 16% for Gen Z and like 13% for the boomers, so I don't think that it was a particular...
No, fair enough.
So, yeah, we shouldn't overstate the problem, right? And especially in the internet age, it's easier to focus on a vocal minority of men online, which is a problem, but I don't think they're necessarily representational. I do think, to focus on one thing, is schools, right? Because we have a system now with schools where there's teachers are overwhelmingly female. The way that we assess pupils over time has been consistently reformed to favour female ways of learning. You can actually basically A/B test this. If you set exams, boys will do better. And then that affects the ability to use schools to teach things like the gender stuff, because as you say, if you had a male teacher who was able to come in, that might be helpful. So I think you do need more male models and to think through some of these structures that are disadvantaging boys, because those concerns are real.
Yes. I mean, Daniel, do you agree with Henry on that in terms of not enough male teachers in schools just to start with?
Yeah. I think there can be a lot of progress made by getting good men into those roles, and also by equipping the men who are in those roles with some of the knowledge so that they can have these more sensitive, subtle, and very nuanced conversations around gender and how that's impacting upon the boys, also how it's impacting upon girls and non-binary people at the same time.
Because one of the issues, I suppose, is that maybe some boys feel that they can't talk about these things, or that they will be vilified if they do say things that perhaps aren't as acceptable in certain circles at school or outside.
Yeah, I think it's really important that young boys have good male role models in their lives, and I think whether it's, you know, somebody who comes into the school and teaches these things, or whether it's a male teacher or a parent, it's vitally important because, as you say, when you're young, you're so vulnerable. You have so many difficult feelings going on, difficult ideas, and you really need someone to talk to who knows what they're talking about and can help you process them. And more young men, I think, partly because of COVID and being, you know, locked away in their room and only having their phones to go on, have been turning to social media and these sort of social media influencers, for example, Andrew Tate, to teach them about relationships and women. And as we know, that makes them incredibly vulnerable to harmful content, to ideas that are damaging towards women. And I think, I also agree with Jess, I do think that the relationship and health education in schools has been suboptimal. I think when teachers are under stress and they don't have enough resource, it's the first thing to be dropped. And it would be so good if there were, you know, external experts who could go into schools and teach this, because I think it is really important. And we are seeing that it really impacts not just men, but also young women as well.
Has that been missed, really, by the government?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily the government's fault as opposed to society at large, but I do think, you know, not everything is our fault or the government's fault. I do think that there's...
Or their responsibility, maybe.
I do think there's an issue, though, that you know, it can be very tough to be a young person of whatever gender you are. And I think unless we acknowledge, alongside everybody else, that it's also tough to be a young man, you will get a small proportion who are somehow feel that the malign influences on the internet speak to some sense of injustice that they have about their lot. And when you look at the statistics, I mean, young men are overwhelmingly represented in prison, overwhelmingly represented in the mental health and the suicide stats, right? You know, the acknowledgement of that is key. And you know, if you look at young men across the board, I'm sure there are lots of them in that proportion that don't think, who feel as if society's not really proud of them in the way it is proud of lots of other young people. And so, you know, we have to be slightly careful, as just said, about making sure that we acknowledge that not every young man is a problem.
Right. No,
lots of them have huge potential for the future, and then we'll do this. But as Henry said, it's not a massive problem, but it is a problem.
Right. I mean, or perhaps a trend, if that's what these figures are saying. Daniel, what do you say in response to what you just heard there from Kit, that perhaps we do need to be more proud of our boys and men in society and recognise some of the issues that are specific to them?
I agree with it. I mean, what we would be doing in our workshop spaces is actually giving those boys a chance to talk about the pressures and the problems that they're facing, and then talk those issues through with people who, well, their classmates, but also people who have a bit more experience, and providing them with the right set of tools to do that. What's crucial is that if we're talking about the problems that boys are facing, we're not turning that into a conversation about this is women's fault or this is feminism's fault. And rather we're looking at, well, how can we actually create a better outcome for all people?
Yeah, I think that the trouble for you know, as a self-declared feminist, the trouble is if all the things that Kit are saying is absolutely true, but it becomes the responsibility of people like me. It becomes but that's how it kind of come across. It's like, well, this is the women's rights movement. Have got to sort this out, and it's like, dudes, you've got quite a lot of power. I'm here with you. I'll help. Let's crack on with it.
Massively counterproductive. You know,
absolutely.
There was a book that came out last year, which was about very much kind of like, you know, I'm a feminist and I'm going to sort the men out. And the reaction from male journalists and readers was phenomenally bad, because that kind of, you know,
women
coming from outside, I'm from Venus and I'm here to help.
A great many years of civil society and of activism in this particular equality space. So and men just haven't had that same level of training to activate themselves. So I would be more than happy to help, but it is definitely something that cannot be put on the shoulders of women to solve this problem.
You know, you would agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's, to be honest with you, it's all of us really have a responsibility to everybody in society to make them feel as if they're all valued members of society. There's a future for them. And that also works on other demographics, whether it's race or gender or whatever, that everybody feels there's something for them in the United Kingdom.
Well,
and, you know,
thank you to all of my guests, including Daniel, for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.
absolute definition